Welcome back, Fellowship family, to this week's episode of the Deeper Podcast. I'm Doug Congdon, and we are going to be doing something a little bit different for these next 3 weeks as we finish out our series called Can I Trust the Bible? As most of you know, and hopefully a lot of you will have come to this by the time you're listening to this, but we have invited Dr. Dan Wallace, a Dallas Theological Seminary professor and one of the world's foremost scholars on textual criticism, to FBC. And he's coming and giving 3 talks, basically, on Can We Trust the Bible? And so what we're going to do over the next 3 weeks is play one each week. And so this week, week 1, he is going to start us off by answering the question, how much did the original scribes corrupt the New Testament? In other words, how many variants do we have? So tune in to this. I hope you are challenged by it, and I hope it leads to some good discussion and maybe even some discovery of your own, on your own, about how we got the Bible that we read today. So enjoy.
There was a monk by the name of Marcos who had been studying at what the equivalent of a theological seminary was in the 6th century AD. And he was very punctilious. He was focused so much on doing very, very careful work, it drove all the other monks crazy. And when he finally graduated, the abbot of the monastery wrote a letter of recommendation for him to go to a scriptorium, a monastery that also has a room where they copy manuscripts. And so the letter, he didn't see it, but the abbot at the next place where he went looked at this letter and said, "This guy's anal." Yeah, there was a word in the 6th, no, it wasn't. Anyway, he's way too detailed. He doesn't get along well with people. He's socially awkward. Sounds like all professors in the world, I think. Then he said, but I think he would probably be good if you kind of left him alone and fed him under the door, you know. I think he'd probably be good if he copied some texts for you. I bet he'd be a good scribe. So Marcos was sent to a particular room by himself, not the regular scriptorium, and he started copying out the bylaws of that monastery. And he copied them for about 20 minutes, and then he came back and knocked on the abbot's door. "Holy Father, I've looked at 2 manuscripts, and there's a lot of discrepancies between them. Have you got something that's older?" So the abbot said, "Yeah, we've got a couple more that are older than these 2. So he looked at those 2, compared them for about 45 minutes, and then, "Holy Father, there's some more discrepancies in these. Have you got anything older than this?" And the abbot is thinking, this guy really is anal. So then he said, "Yeah, we do have the original bylaws of this monastery. We keep them in an archive room so that nobody has seen them for centuries." So the abbot took him down to this archive room. He said, "Be very, very careful as you copy this." And about 20 minutes later, on the abbot's door were several monks pounding their hands on the door. I'd do that, except my computer is a little old, it might break. So they said, "Holy Father, this new monk has gone berserk. He's just beside himself." So the abbot has to rush down to this archive room through a labyrinthian path, and I've been through at a number of monasteries where they actually do have those kinds of paths that you have to almost have a code to get through them. And he looked at Brother Marcos, and he's just pounding on the desk and sobbing. And he said, "They left out the letter R. This guy is really anal." So the abbot said, what are you talking about?" Marcos said, "The word is supposed to be celebrate." You guys kind of caught that from here, kind of rolling along. This group over here, you must be from Las Vegas, root for the Raiders, I guess. You know, those folks are a little bit slow all the time. All right. What I'm addressing in these first two lectures is, has the New Testament text been corrupted? And for this first one, the question is, how much have the scribes corrupted the text? I want to begin. This is a photograph, by the way, of the oldest manuscript of Paul's letters that has quite a bit of Paul. It's a papyrus, and my organization, CSNTM, digitized it in 2014, one of those years, at the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, where it was purchased back in 1931 from Egypt. This papyrus, it's almost, you can see it's almost a complete page. There's only 10-15% of it missing. And this is true for all 86 leaves that it has, out of an original 104. It's one of our oldest manuscripts, and it happens to be the most complete manuscript we have of any of the papyri. Those are our oldest manuscripts. Papyrus is like the consistency of grocery bags, not the plastic kind. But it's amazing that this thing has been so well preserved. And if you go to our website, csntm.org, you can see hundreds of thousands of images of manuscripts. Our goal is to go all over the world and digitize all the New Testament manuscripts because they're falling apart. There's thievery, there's bad conditions they exist in. One monastery's library just burned down a few years ago, a Greek monastery. And so we have an urgent task to get these manuscripts digitized. We've got about 1,000 manuscripts so far digitized, but you'll see how many there are in a few minutes. But csntm.org. You can remember that as CS as in C.S. Lewis. You all know who C.S. Lewis is. And have you ever watched The Wizard of Oz? If you're under 30, you've never even heard of it. It's a great movie. Wizard of Oz, Anti-M. C.S. Anti-M. CSNTM. You'll remember it that way if you're old enough. Okay, has the New Testament been corrupted? Let's talk about how much it has been corrupted. I want to start by quoting that great scholar, Dan Brown, in his Da Vinci Code. And he has Sir Lee Teabing, who is meeting with Sophie and the guy from Harvard, talking about the Bible. And Mr. Teabing, or Sir Teabing, says the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Now, we know this is a novel, but this particular book has been required reading in a number of classes that teach religion. And it's used to show how Christianity has a really faulty basis. Because even though it's a historical novel, apparently the teachers believe this. Well, here's something that should be taken a little bit more seriously. The Bible's so misunderstood, it's a sin. This is in Newsweek by Kurt Eichenwald. And notice that it got published just before Christmas 11 years ago. This is typical. When you get skeptics to criticize the Bible and Christianity, you get a flood of TV shows and films and radio broadcasts right around Christmas time and right around Easter every year. It's just really predictable. Well, here he wrote this article, the Bible's so misunderstood it's a sin. And what Eichenwald says is, he has a section called Playing Telephone with the Word of God. Do y'all know what telephone is, the telephone game? And so here's what he has to say about it. It's really interesting. He says, no television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope. And neither have I. So far, I'd probably say yes to all that. That's supposed to be a joke. Then he goes on and he says, and neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation, a translation of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies, and on hundreds of times. what he is saying is, apparently, he has this view that once you have a manuscript copied, you destroy the first manuscript, the exemplar, the one that is being copied. This was a view I had when I was in junior high school, when my parents got me a Bible, a modern translation, and I read the preface, and it was a revision of the King James called the Revised Standard Version. And I thought, well, do they not know Greek and Hebrew? Are there any Greek and Hebrew manuscripts anymore? I thought it was just a modern updating of the King James Bible. I got rid of that notion in 8th grade, but Kurt Eichenwald still holds to it. I wish I could have the time to go through and how the Bible is the furthest thing removed from the telephone game, but I've got probably more material than I'm supposed to have tonight, so we'll have to press on. C.J. Werleman is an atheist, and Werleman's first book is God Hates You, Hate Him Back. I think it's a funny title for an atheist, isn't it? I mean, what God hates you? Shouldn't it be titled Nothing Hates You, Hate Nothing Back? But he likes to write provocative books. So here you got Jesus, who's hooked up to a lie detector. And Jesus lied. He was only human. And then it's debunking the New Testament. At one point he says, we do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. Well, that sounds a little bit more serious than a novel. But you actually get somebody who was the #1 British apologist for Islam. He died just a few years ago, but in his book, The History of the Quranic Text, From Revelation to Compilation, a comparative study with the Old and New Testaments, here's what M.M. al-Azami has to say. The Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God, but just a man; Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man, which was actually more popular than adoptionism in the 2nd century; and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, the sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. He believes this happened in AD 325 at the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council that is church-wide, universal council, where Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, actually started it. He was there at the beginning of the summer, and then he came back at the end. But he was just there at the beginning and end. And that council was used to define what they meant by the deity of Christ. They also discussed the date of Easter and some other things, but that was the primary thing that the Council of Nicaea did. But what al-Azami is saying is that council also determined what scripture, what New Testament books should be in the New Testament, and also that they demolished, they destroyed all the other manuscripts. Keep this in mind. AD 325, M.M. al-Azami is saying there are no manuscripts of the New Testament before AD 325, and that Constantine invented the canon. Well, where do these guys get their material from? They get it almost always from a man by the name of Bart Ehrman. And Bart, I've known him for 42 years. We're friends. We've had 3 debates with each other. And he has a book that came out in 2005 called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. He has the credentials. He went to Moody Bible College. He went to Wheaton College, got his bachelor's there. He went to Princeton Seminary, got his master's under the great Bruce Metzger, who is a conservative scholar, probably the best textual scholar of the 20th century. Textual scholar or textual critic, that's someone who examines the available evidence and tries to determine the original wording of a document whose original actually is lost. He was probably the best in the 20th century worldwide. And then Ehrman got his doctorate under Bruce Metzger. He got a great education. He has all the bona fides. And so when he speaks, people listen. And the ones I just showed you, they take a lot from what he's done. He said, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the copies of the original. Sound familiar? Yes, C.J. Werleman. Oh, and towards the end of this book, Misquoting Jesus, he says, the more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. Well, I think this has been a good introduction to textual criticism. Let's close in prayer, then we'll... Some of you are old enough to remember Paul Harvey, and he would start by saying, and now for the rest of the story. Well, I'll tell you the rest of the story now. If you don't know who Paul Harvey is, then you probably don't know what the Wizard of Oz is either, so it doesn't matter. As we get into this, there's two attitudes that we have to avoid, and I seriously mean this. The first is radical skepticism. Probably in this audience, we don't have more than just a handful of radical skeptics, those who say we can't possibly get back to the original text of the New Testament, so why even try? It's been changed so much, and it's been, the theology of it has changed so much that Jesus becomes a god in these later manuscripts. That's not an attitude that we should have. It's irrational, and it's not based on empirical evidence. But the second attitude is one that's very easy for Christians to fall into, absolute certainty. Now, there's one group that especially falls into this attitude, and that is King James only people. They are absolutely certain that the King James Bible is the only thing that can be called Holy Bible, as they've told me. And I actually met two different people, one in Texas and one in Ohio, none in Kansas yet, but two people who actually believed this when they said, if the King James Bible was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for me. So when they say that, I have to change the tempo of what we're discussing. And I pitch it at a level they can understand. So I say, how about them cowboys? You know, and that's where we go from there. But absolute certainty is something that affects many of you, too. You come to church, you bring your Bible. Is there a particular translation you use here? ESV? Yeah, I was a consultant for that a little bit. Years ago, they published a statement that said the ESV will never change because people were memorizing out of it, they loved it, and it was not 6 weeks later when they had to go back on what they had just said. We have to keep revising this Bible because of new evidence and because of research on the text that helps us to understand the original better. By the way, the King James was revised 3 times, and the last time was done in 1769, and between the 1611 and the 1769, over 100,000 changes were made. Now, the vast majority of those are spelling, but some of them are fairly significant. Absolute certainty is something that can affect us. If you think the ESV is the Word of God in every single respect, down to the very words on every single page, what happens when in the next edition they've changed some of those words? Now, I'm on the NIV translation committee, and I was on the Net Bible Translation Committee as well. NIV is the only standing committee that meets every year for a week or two, about 14 scholars who are absolutely brilliant, and then they asked me to join. I don't know what they were smoking that day, but so I've been on it for 7 years now, and the conversations are so rich. We come with 200 or 300 pages worth of proposals, and we meet for at least a week somewhere in the world. And my first year, we have to have a 75% majority to pass anything in any kind of revisions for the NIV. The latest revision was 2011, and we're always working towards another revision. Small changes, but ones that we think are important. The goal of the NIV, not to pitch it against the ESV, just to say this is the goal of these translators, is to communicate as clearly as possible in modern English, natural English, what the readers in the first century and before that for the Old Testament, how they were reading the text in Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek. My first meeting there, when we met in Belfast, they spent 45 minutes on a comma. A comma. He said, does it go here? It affects the interpretation this way, or does it go here? I thought, these guys, I thought I was pretty, well, I won't use that word again than I did of Brother Marcos, but the thing that's amazing about them is we have all stripes. We have people who are Reformed, we have Pentecostals, we have men, we actually have women on the committee, egalitarians, complementarians, people from various countries. And when we vote, and we'll have a really spirited discussion over something, when we're done with a vote, we just move on. No hurt feelings, we continue on. And it's the way Christian fellowship should be. And this is Christian fellowship at the highest level of scholarship. I think among those 14 scholars, I think they know about 60 languages. It's incredible. One of them by himself knows 40, but we won't go there. Okay, so, but you may have this Bible that you think is the Word of God in every single respect, but that is not true. It is the Word of God. Absolutely, this is the Word of God. But can I claim that for every single word in here? Well, first of all, it's a translation. There's always something lost in translation. That's why we have commentaries, and that's why we have pastors and preachers. So somewhere between radical skepticism and absolute certainty is where we need to land. There's 3 issues that I want us to address. How much did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? How badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? And has the essence of the Christian faith been changed by the scribes? The first issue, how much did the scribes corrupt the New Testament, is what we'll deal with this first hour. The second hour, how badly did the scribes corrupt the New Testament? And we'll also finish off that with, has the essence of the Christian faith been changed by the scribes? And then for our third session, we'll talk about, did the ancient church muzzle the canon? Little play on words there if you know how to spell. All right. Got a preliminary question though. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? No, we don't. All these 27 books must have turned to dust within 100 years, maybe within 40 or 50 years after they were written. We have evidence that suggests that, but they just disappeared. Why would they be gone? Because they were being copied so frequently. Not by professional scribes to start with, but some guy who lives in Corinth finds out that the Romans had gotten a letter from Paul. So he and his scribe go to Rome, and he says, hey, do you mind if my scribe copies this out? Sure, that'd be great. And he's not a professional scribe. He's probably just a bean counter, an accountant, something like that. So they make copies, but it just spread without any kind of control over it for the first 3 centuries. We don't have the originals anymore. Well, what about the copies? Do they all say the same thing? Well, if they did, if they all said exactly the same thing, then we wouldn't be able to do textual criticism. That doesn't mean we'd know what the original is, but we'd just, okay, I guess that's the best we got. but they don't all say the same thing. On average, the closest Greek manuscripts of the New Testament in the first 8 centuries disagree with each other between 6 and 10 times per chapter. There's 260 chapters in the New Testament, so extrapolate that out and you've got a couple thousand disagreements. So because of the disappearance of the originals and the disagreements among the copies, we have to do what's called textual criticism. Criticism does not mean we're just criticizing the Bible. It's another word for research. We're doing the best kind of research we can to determine as best we can what the original wording is. And what my organization, CSNTM, is doing is providing these digital images. We were the very first to digitize any New Testament manuscripts back in 2002 with a state-of-the-art digital camera of 4 megapixels. Now we have a 150,000 megapixel, no, 150 megapixel, yeah, that's right, 150 megapixel camera that cost us $1,000 per megapixel. A little more expensive, a little bit better quality. But that's what everyone is now using our digital images to help them get back to the original. Okay, there's another preliminary question though. What is a textual variant? It's any place among the manuscripts in which there is variation in wording, including word order, omission, or addition of words, even spelling differences. We'll give an illustration later from John chapter 4, verse 1, probably at the end of the second lecture. But one thing I do want to say, some evangelicals, ever since 1963, and a very popular book came out that's now sold over 1 million copies, have said that here's what a textual variant is. It's any place where there's a difference between the manuscripts, but say I have 1,000 manuscripts that say Lord and 1,000 manuscripts that say Jesus. That's not one variant from Jesus or one variant from Lord. It's 1,000 variants. That's what the miscalculation of evangelicals was in 1963, and it's affected and infected even many apologists to this very day. That's not how variants are counted. A variant is any difference between any 2 manuscripts, and we count each time we see that difference, regardless of if it's in 1 manuscript or 1,000. So how many variants do we have? Well, let's start with how many words are in the New Testament. Approximately 138,162. Now, ask me how I know that. Go ahead, somebody ask me, how do you know that? Okay, good, you guys are awake. When I was 8 years old, I grew up in Newport Beach, California, and I am a rebel because the surf sucks in Dallas, so I always wear my Hawaiian shirts. My dad took us to a Dodgers game. I'm still dyed-in-the-wool LA Rams, Dodgers, Lakers. And he took us to a doubleheader with Don Drysdale and Sandy Koufax. Can you believe that? Those of you who are under 50 have no idea what I'm talking about. So, and we won both games. I guess I really wasn't watching. I was counting lights in the stadium. And my older brother was all involved in the game, and we got back to the car, and Dad said, well, Danny, what do you think about the games? And I said, I don't know. Did we win? Yeah, we won. Oh, that's good. Did you know there's 164,000 lights here, and that 351 of them are burned out? Okay, that tells you way too much about me. My wife calls me an HMH, a high-maintenance husband, because I'm so focused on things I don't see the world around me, and because I'm really very absent-minded. Anyway, how many variants do we have among our Greek manuscripts only? The New Testament was originally written in Greek. This is drawn to scale. Approximately 1.5 million differences among the manuscripts. More than 10 times the number of words in the New Testament. Are you discouraged now? I hope so. Now we're going to dig out of this hole. Now for the rest of the story. C.S. Lewis said, the moment the miracle enters nature's realm, it obeys all her laws. Miraculous wine will intoxicate. Miraculous conception will lead to pregnancy. Inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption. Miraculous bread will be digested. The point he's making is once the inspired Word of God gets copied the very first time, there's going to be differences because scribes are human. So why are there so many variants, though? What do they do to our confidence in the Bible? Well, we have so many variants because we have a lot of manuscripts. Let me show you something that was published 300 years ago. John Mill's Novum Testamentum Graeca, 1707. John Mill was an Oxford scholar who spent his entire adult career, 30 years, finding as many manuscripts as he could that would have, he could list in terms of differences from the standard published Greek New Testament at the time, which was known as the Textus Receptus. It goes all the way back to 1516 when a man named Erasmus published the first Greek New Testament. And it was kind of the standard that was used, and after a couple of hundred years, people were starting to say, wait a minute, there's got to be other manuscripts that are older, and they started to have doubts about it. But nobody did anything for another 100 years in terms of changing the text. But John Mill looked at every manuscript he could find, 99 manuscripts. He went through and transcribed all the data. He looked at several ancient translations and the writings of the church fathers. And he produced a rather large volume that had a text, and then below the line, the footnotes, or what we call an apparatus. And in that apparatus were 30,000 textual variants. I'll show you the title page of this book. I've never shown this before. This is really, I love this. You see the title page, but you see on the left side, that is one ripped Jesus. I mean, my gosh. Puts Arnold to shame. But this was his work. Now exactly 2 weeks later after he got it published, he died. When I get my magnum opus done, I hope to die within a couple of weeks because I can avoid all the critics that way. And in this realm, in textual criticism, I don't know any group of scholars that are harsher on others than textual critics are. They are critical of others in a very subjective and sometimes ad hominem way, as well as trying to get down to, is it this letter or this letter? Is it an R or not an R? That kind of thing. Okay, here's a page from the Apocalypse, the last book of the New Testament, and it has this apparatus where it has variants from this. The Apocalypse has fewer manuscripts than any other, Revelation is the name of the book too, has fewer manuscripts than any other book of the New Testament. And yet that's a pretty thick apparatus, footnotes. Well, Mill died before he could defend what he had done. Conservative Christians, though, reacted to what he had done with this book. And they said, you've done the work of the devil. Well, he couldn't defend himself. He was dead. But they said, this is, you're stirring up people now. They realize there's variance among the manuscripts. They don't know if they can trust their Bibles anymore. They don't know if they can trust their Greek New Testament that's been translated into many, many languages. You're doing the work of the devil. Friends, I got to tell you, historical research is never the work of the devil. When God became man in Jesus Christ, the incarnation itself was God walking on earth. We know the places he went to. We know some of the people he healed. We know who his disciples were. We even know where he healed people, almost to the square foot where he was standing. Let me give you an example. Mark chapter 2, Jesus heals this paralytic who is dropped between the thatched roof. Some four friends are pulling the thatched roof at Peter's house and dropping him down so he could be right in front of Jesus, where Jesus was teaching a packed crowd that was inside the house and standing outside as well. Jesus says to the man, your sins are forgiven. And then I won't get into the story, I'm sorry. It's a great passage, but then Jesus says, take up your bed, I guess. I don't know if he said that. Anyway, he healed the man. I'm getting that confused with John 5, I think. But he healed this man, and the man walked out. That place is still there. I think it's, is it Capernaum or Bethsaida? I always forget that. Doug, where are you? Capernaum. Oh, you guys are good. And you guys, you have such a fabulous museum outside. I'm just so impressed with that. And your Hezekiah's tunnel, I've been through that thing. I don't want to go through yours. I'm very claustrophobic, and I don't know if I'll get out the other end. But nevertheless, that's a different topic. Okay, so I've been to Peter's house. There's a Catholic monument there, and it's plexiglass above the house, and we can point to the very place where Jesus must have been standing to teach. We can see the place that's the doorway where he left. This stuff it's flesh and blood. It's time, space, history. When Jesus was raised from the dead, he could walk through walls. So why did that huge stone weighing about 2,000 pounds get rolled away? It wasn't for him to get out. It was for the apostles to go in and see that the tomb was empty. The incarnation gives us a methodological imperative to do historical research. Never be afraid of what you're going to find, but don't restrict your research to the internet. That's where you'll get lots of naysayers and you can get really confused. Use good sources. Okay, so that was conservative Christians, Protestants. Catholics were gleeful about this whole thing. What they said was, oh, you guys have a Protestant Pope, and he disagrees with himself on every single page, not like our Pope who speaks ex cathedra. It took Richard Bentley, 6 years later, scholar at Cambridge University, in his book Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking, to defend Mill. And here's one of the things he said that stuck with me for years. If there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at this restoration of learning 2 centuries ago, and he's talking about when Erasmus published the first Greek New Testament based on 9 manuscripts. If he had only had one, Bentley says, then we would have no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. The reason we have so many variants is because we have an embarrassment of riches. That includes just the Greek manuscripts. The unofficial number a few years ago was 5,999. When I was a student in seminary in the 70s, the number was 4,800. Now, we haven't actually added 1,200 more. There's various reasons. Some of them are parts of other manuscripts and things, but this is the official number that comes out of an institute in Münster, Germany, that is the official cataloger of Greek New Testaments. You can use this and say there are officially 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts in the world. So when you're at Starbucks and somebody says, well, it's been copied and copied so many times, then translated and translated. You don't even have early copies, and you don't have very many. Oh, did you know there's 5,700 copies? We also have Latin manuscripts. The New Testament was translated into Latin very early on, as early as the late 2nd century. That's the 100s. And the numbers are somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000. We haven't counted them all, but we have more manuscripts in Latin than we do in Greek. And we also have other ancient translations like Coptic and Syriac. There's thousands between those two. Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, Arabic, even Hebrew manuscripts. We've just got tons of ancient translations in Georgian, Gothic, all sorts of languages. So we have all together, counting all this evidence, all this is before the time of the printing press, somewhere between, I'd say, conservatively, 20,000 manuscripts to 25,000 manuscripts. Now, they don't have the whole New Testament, most of them don't. But the average manuscript is more than 400 pages long. and they'll have the Gospels, or they'll have Paul's letters and other things. It's just incredible. Classical scholars would give their eye teeth to have the kinds of embarrassments that New Testament scholars have. Now, if you had a magic wand and you could wipe out all of those manuscripts in one fell swoop, we would still not be left without a witness. And that's because of quotations from the New Testament by church fathers. A lot of our manuscripts have the text kind of front and center on the page, and then they have a wraparound commentary by a church father in smaller font. So you get actually the Greek text and the commentary. And these church fathers did not have the gift of brevity. They would comment and go on and on and on. And at times they'd even talk about textual variants. I know about this variant, and I think it'll go back to the original. Here's another one. I don't think it does. That's absolutely invaluable. But they cover the whole New Testament. And we have, in the church fathers, in the 1920s, the number was 700,000. That was just looking at the Latin fathers. It's well over 1 million. I don't know what the number is. I'm not sure anybody does. Over 1 million quotations of the New Testament that has fewer than 8,000 verses. What I think is fascinating here is that we could virtually reproduce the entire New Testament many times over from just the writings of the church fathers. That's incredible. There's no way to quantify that. I don't know how you can put this on the list of the numbers, but I'll get to a certain point, and I'd like this first session to go till 4. What, Doug? Where's Doug? When did you bring me up here? You went on for a long time.
That's fine. You can go a little after 4, wherever you.
Okay. Yeah, this I think will be the longest, but I want to be patient, considerate of your time. You want to be patient with me, I want to be considerate of you. Okay. The typical Greek writer has fewer than 15 copies of his or her works still in existence. Stack them up and they're 3.5 to 4 feet tall. How would the New Testament manuscripts stack up? Well, we'll get to that towards the end of this, but I wanted to bring in some well-known Greek writers, not just the average ones. And this is going to be very quick, so if you don't write it all down, you're going to get the video of this. But take Homer's Iliad. Homer was the most popular Greek author of the ancient world, and he had an 800 or 900 year head start, on the New Testament. He's in the 8th century BC, and Homer, his Iliad, was the most popular book of his 2 major works, Iliad and Odyssey. Now, even with that 900-year head start, the copies of Homer's Iliad don't even come close to the New Testament. But there's been a lot of misstatements about what the number is based on old data. Even Ehrman, in his book with his mentor Bruce Metzger, The Text of the New Testament, that was the 4th edition of one that Metzger published in 1964. Even in that book, they say there's 643 copies of Homer's Iliad in part or whole. That's not even close to the truth. They didn't count the ancient papyri and some others that have been discovered. So here he is. He writes in the 8th century BC. He shaped Greek literature for more than 2,000 years. Every Greek schoolboy for centuries were required to read this. Even Alexander the Great brought his copy of the Iliad with him when he was conquering the world. And it was the most popular writing in Greek until the New Testament. So even with that kind of a head start, here's what we actually have. About 700 parchment copies. I think that's correct. And about 1,800 papyrus fragments. Now these don't have much material. Like our papyri, they're usually pretty small, but they have very little of what Homer actually said. But the oldest fragment, part of one chapter, comes 400 years after Homer wrote. That's remarkable. So we've got about 2,500 copies, and I'm comparing apples and oranges. we're talking about copies in various translations as well. So let's look at some popular Greco-Roman historians and biographers. That comes closest to the genre of the New Testament. Now, Pindar, who wrote his odes, was a lyric poet. He doesn't fit that, but it's a fun illustration. Okay, Pliny the Elder's Natural History, he's a first century writer. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. He was the Jewish historian who lived from 37 to 100, and Josephus wrote the Jewish War with Rome in AD 66 to 70 that Jesus predicted in the Olivet Discourse. And he also wrote Antiquities of the Jews, going back all the way to Adam up to the present time. And then there's Plutarch's Lives. He talks about great men of Greece and Rome. Herodotus' Histories. Herodotus is called the father of history. And then Pindar's Odes. Okay, so here we have. Did I mention Pliny? Oh, I skipped Pliny. Okay, well, Pliny the Elder, small fragment, 5th century AD. About 200 total copies, the oldest substantial copies, 8th century. He's writing in the 1st century. Josephus, the oldest substantial copy is from the 6th century, parts of 6 books out of his 20. Now, those books are relatively short, not quite as short as our New Testament books, but they are short. But this papyrus has parts of 6 books out of the 20, and it's coming 500 years after the New Testament was written. And then there's Plutarch. Plutarch wrote these lives of notable Greek and Roman senators and politicians and warriors and all, generals. And he lived in the 1st century and a little bit into the 2nd. His oldest copies, the oldest copies of Plutarch's lives come from the 9th century. The oldest complete copy, 13th century. That's just incredible. Plutarch is important for the Gospels because he frequently has more than one biography on a particular person, or he'll dip into talking about Julius Caesar while he's talking about somebody else, and then he has another one on Julius Caesar. It's one person, and yet he varies what he says so that there's a number of differences between his 2 accounts. Yet it's by the same author. We see the same thing in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are a number of differences, but are there discrepancies? I don't think so, but there are differences. And Plutarch gives us an important parallel to them. Okay, Herodotus is the father of history, 5th century BC, and his book Histories, 109 manuscripts. The first substantial one, 9th century AD. So we're talking about, 1,500 years, 1,400 years since he wrote this. The first substantial copy of Herodotus. For the New Testament, that would be like the first substantial copy is when Columbus came to America. And then we have Pindar's lyric poetry. He lived in the 6th to the 5th century BC, and his oldest substantial copies are 13th century and the 16th century. Now, most of his works are only in fragments. We're not sure if we have the whole, but we do have one manuscript from the 13th century and one manuscript from the 16th. If the New Testament had that kind of witnesses, the first substantial copies would be about when the Wright brothers invented the airplane. Now your friends at Starbucks or at the office would have something to say, wouldn't they? And they tend to have this impression of, well, the New Testament's been, what we've already rehearsed. They just have no idea about the wealth of evidence we have for the New Testament, nor how early it is. So they never compare it to the classical writers, either because they don't know about them or because they don't want to know about them. So the New Testament, now let's compare the New Testament to the average classical author. The average classical author, as I said, has maybe 15 copies, and that's a pretty generous estimate. How high would that be? That's stacked about the size of a podium. How about the New Testament? What would that be? Well, let me get the right picture here. This is the Empire State Building, and for those of you who are Raiders fans, that's in New York City, just to let you know where it is. So the New Testament would be represented by the Empire State Building, which is 1,454 feet tall, including the radio tower. but this is not to scale. Let's make this to scale. Can you see that pixel? Can you see that? Oh yeah, you can. This really is to scale. I worked very hard at this. I hope you appreciate it. That's 4 feet tall now. That's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. I got a lot more room on this slide though. Four and a half Empire State Buildings. 1 mile high before we even finish off the fourth one. We have somewhere about 6,235 feet tall. I think it's safe to say we have more than a mile high of manuscripts of the New Testament. And again, in Greek and these other languages. And I've done some very careful measurements on that. I won't belabor you with those details. That's incredible, isn't it? I mean, you think, okay, you get average Greek writer, New Testament manuscripts to the ceiling. Oh, you're not even in the ballpark. It's amazing. So I want to talk to you briefly about the date of New Testament manuscripts. And it is 4 o'clock, so I'll go. I think you want me to keep going a little bit longer? Yeah. Okay. I was going to put this in the next section, but let's do this. So the discovery of P52, Papyrus 52. We have today, I think the number is P141 is the latest. On average, a papyrus of the New Testament is found about every year, the first one in the late 19th century. These are typically our earliest manuscripts of the New Testament. All of them are found in Egypt where the climate is dry enough to preserve them for centuries. But let me tell you about this papyrus. I want to back up to the year 1844. And in the Tübinger Jahrbuch, a scholar by the name of, that won't be on the quiz, don't worry about it, F.C. Bauer, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, who was influenced by Professor Hegel at the University of Tübingen. He held to Hegelian dialectic. Do you all know what Hegelian dialectic is? Well, you might, maybe on a Tuesday or Wednesday, but this is Sunday, you're wasted, so I don't mean it, I'm sorry. But you all know it by thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's Hegelian dialectic in a nutshell. Like, you have the thesis, my children will not get tattoos. Antithesis, your daughter says, Dad, I want a tattoo on my ankle. Synthesis, she gets a tattoo on the ankle and just blows you off. That's kind of Hegelian dialectic. Well, what Bauer did was he said John's gospel and the book of Acts are the synthesis of the two schools of early Christianity, the Peter school and the Paul school. And John's gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160. He felt the original date of the gospel was really 170. 90 years later, a scholar by the name of Colin H. Roberts was at Manchester University, and I believe he was going through maybe a box of some sort of papyri that had been excavated from Egypt in 1920, and his the previous scholar who had retired from that post and then went elsewhere, Roberts saw a fragment about the size of a credit card. This is a picture of one side of it. And this is called a professional hand. It's a very good hand, so the scribe knew what he was doing. And what was remarkable about it was there was writing on both sides. Now, all books that we know of through the first century, except for maybe itty-bitty, tiny, almost 20-page type notebooks or something, were all written on a scroll. They were written on the inside of the scroll because they wrote on papyrus. Papyrus has fibers, and you make a papyrus manuscript by laying down the fibers, the strip of the papyrus plant going horizontal, and then the backside would be vertical, and they pound it with a mallet and let it soak in water for 7 days or so, and then they start cutting it into sheets. They wouldn't write on the backside because those fibers are going vertically. They would only write on the inside of the scroll. All the New Testament books were certainly written on a scroll, or what scholars call a roll. Even the book of Revelation, our last book of the New Testament. Remember, John talks about the seven sealed book? Well, that seven sealed book, he cries because the seventh seal can't be opened. If that were a codex, like our modern book, like this, you could go to that last section, or you could read ahead, like on a paperback book that you take to the beach, and you're reading a mystery novel or a detective novel, and you're getting to the last page, and it's gone, because it's in a codex. Those outside leaves fall off. But with a scroll, what they would do is they'd put a wax strip down as they get through one area, so the book opens up to the first section, second, third, fourth, fifth, and only Jesus Christ can open the seventh. Well, Revelation was written on a scroll. But this manuscript had writing on the front side and the back side. And he read what it was. John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33 on the front, 37 and 38 on the back, fragments of it. That meant this was written on a codex. Now, we know the codex was invented about the middle of the first century, but nobody was really using it yet. However, the Christians adopted it very early on. In fact, all of our New Testament manuscripts are written on a codex. Our very earliest ones, the later ones, they're not written on a scroll. So we know we don't have the originals, we have copies. But in the first 5 centuries of the Christian era, over 90% of all Christian books and all books of the Bible were written on a codex. Meanwhile, for the rest of the world, for the first 5 centuries, less than 15% were written on a codex. They were still written on a scroll. Now, if you're under 30, you may never have seen a codex. It looks like this. It's cut pages. It's got a binding on one side, and you can flip to anywhere you want. Because what you do if you're under 30 is you're always on your computer, and what do? You scroll. You've gone retro on us, guys. This is a modern book form. Get used to it. It was the first time, and probably the only time in the history of the church, where Christians were ahead of the technological curve, because they used the codex. So Roberts looks at this and he says, this is written on a codex. Then he sends photographs to the 3 leading papyrus scholars of the time. Papyrologists is what they're called. They knew how to date manuscripts by the handwriting, comparing it to other papyri that actually had written dates in them. And all 3 of them said this should be dated somewhere between AD 100 and 150. A 4th, a German scholar, demurred, and he said, I think it might go back to the 90s of the first century. A copy of John's Gospel. Now, it's not much material. What it has is exactly what our critical texts or our scholarly editions have for this portion of John. But what it did was it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. Going back to F.C. Bauer, he had convinced much of Europe John's Gospel has no historical credibility. It is not written till after 160. And I don't know about you, but I grew up in Southern California, and I was taught that, generally speaking, a copy is not made before the original is. Is that kind of what you've learned here too? It's remarkable what this small discovery did. So it leads me to what a New Testament scholar in Seattle had on his desk. He said, a pound of evidence, or an ounce of evidence, is worth a pound of presumption. And I just had AI create this for me last night. That's pretty cool, isn't it? I've been trying to do other things, and it's just terrible, but AI has helped me with this lecture. So I got to tell you, I didn't do any of this by myself. All of it is actually done by AI, and I'm just a spokesman. Okay, so let me show you what we have in terms of the dates of manuscripts, century by century. And this is, you'll get a picture of this later, but here's the thing. We have as many as a dozen manuscripts from the 2nd century, from the 100s, and continuously the numbers build till we get to the 10th century, the 900s. We have almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone. Now compare that to the average Greco-Roman author. There are 4 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. It's just stunning what the evidence is. Within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone, several hundred years before any copies of the average classical author's writings. That is, most classical authors were waiting 1,000 years or more before we get any copies that have survived. It's remarkable. So that brings me to the question. This is how we'll finish this first lecture. So, that's good. 4:10, that's what I wanted to end at. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times we don't know what it originally said, like C.J. Werleman and Eichenwald says? Well, here's a nice little graph for you. In 1611, when the King James Bible was done, the New Testament was based on essentially 9 manuscripts. The oldest was the 11th century. That means the 1000s. About 9 manuscripts. 2025, we have 5,700 manuscripts in Greek alone, and the oldest go back to the 2nd century. As time goes on, here's the bottom line, we are getting closer and closer to the original text. So you can throw away what all these guys said, copies of copies of copies. No, it's not the telephone game, because we're not just interviewing the last person in a line. We're interviewing several people way up the line in several different lines. And it's not like the telephone game where you're whispering something once in somebody's ear. Scribes copied by writing what they read. We have almost no evidence of them copying by a lecturer, reading the text out loud and them writing it down. Virtually no evidence. That's pretty amazing, isn't it?